The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson parked his car in the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The warm morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Kendrick exhaled deeply. He hated being late as a federal prosecutor. His professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness. But today life had conspired against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The task ahead was mundane. Challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Kendrick had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house was more than property to him. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye, dressed in a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt. Kendrick looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been far from smooth. An urgent phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Kendrick couldn't ignore it. He had reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to court, knowing he was cutting it close as he approached the courthouse steps. His phone buzzed. A quick glance showed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Kendrick sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something in the message lingered. He shook it off as he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The municipal court wasn't like the federal courts, where Kendrick spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige. The seats scuffed from decades of use. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents. Faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m., 10 minutes to spare, barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people speaking in hushed tones. Room 204. Judge Charles Whitman was etched in brass on the door. Kendrick adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people. Kendrick found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence as he scanned his notes. He noticed the judge entering the room. Judge Charles Whitman, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Kendrick joined in his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. Kendrick noticed the stark silence that followed. Judge Whitman began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Kendrick watched closely. A middle-aged man in a suit, arriving a few minutes late, shuffled into the room unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Kendrick made a mental note but focused on his own case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Kendrick heard his name called. He gathered his folder and made his way to the podium, projecting calm, despite the slight delay. As he approached, Judge Whitman looked up, his expression hardening. Kendrick felt the shift in the room, a quiet tension that hadn't been present for the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand, slightly palms out, in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you re-evaluate your priorities." Kendrick felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness, if I may. I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment. Judge Whitman waved a hand dismissively. We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Kendrick's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral around him. Murmurs rippled through the room. Your Honor. Kendrick began, his tone calm and measured. May I explain? The judge raised his gavel, silencing him. You may not consider this a lesson in respecting the court. Kendrick stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. It was about something deeper, something that many in the room had likely seen before he glanced briefly at the other latecomers. None of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Kendrick wasn't about to let it slide as he returned to his seat. Kendrick opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The judge, meanwhile, continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Kendrick knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary morning. Kendrick sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom proceeded in its rhythm, but Kendrick couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Whitman imposed the $750 fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front, scrolling on her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a grey blazer, now presenting his case, had clearly walked in after the judge began, yet the gavel's ire had been reserved solely for Kendrick. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern Kendrick could recognize as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine this steep for tardiness in municipal court was extreme, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him, a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Kendrick could tell that others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak. Next case. Judge Whitman announced. Kendrick's name echoed in the room again. He stood his stride, calm and deliberate, as he returned to the podium. The judge fixed him with the same piercing gaze, as if daring him to falter. Kendrick began, Your Honor. I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values. He placed the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal neatly organized documents and photographs. He gestured toward a specific page. This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. I'll review it in due time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court? Kendrick's composure remained intact. Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't waver. Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't the words themselves that struck Kendrick. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, even his effort to respect the system, none of it mattered. In this room, Kendrick took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple of unease passed through the room. The judge stiffened, the color in his face deepening. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court?" "Mr. Robinson, I'm asking for clarity," Kendrick replied, his tone. "Even it's important to ensure that fairness is upheld not just for myself, but for everyone here." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Kendrick inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. He could sense the quiet admiration of some and the trepidation of others. This wasn't the first time Kendrick had encountered bias cloaked in authority. But something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for what he would do next. Kendrick pulled out his phone, discreetly typing notes he wasn't done. Not by a long shot, he made a quiet decision. Then and there, this situation wouldn't end here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Kendrick's presence had already shifted the atmosphere. Others noticed it too. An older black man, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief, knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort visible when the session ended. Kendrick lingered for a moment as people filed out. He observed the way they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression one of awe and determination. Kendrick left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand. His thoughts already forming a plan. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment, or even the fine. This was about something much larger. Something he couldn't ignore as Kendrick exited the courtroom. The crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings, but inside Kendrick's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant U.S. attorney back at the office. "No," he muttered to himself. "Not yet." He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Whitman's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental, it was structural. Kendrick's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment back in his car. Kendrick opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem, embossed in gold, reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be the first move by the time he re-entered the courtroom. Most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Whitman was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Kendrick walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand as he approached the podium. The court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-type. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. "Mr. Robinson, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment," the judge said curtly with respect. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Kendrick's words registered around the room. The remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention." Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful, "and while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here. Today, the judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning," Kendrick replied, holding up his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson?" "I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor," Kendrick said calmly. "As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns." The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Kendrick and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels." Kendrick placed his badge and identification on the podium. "I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom." Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had presided over this courtroom for decades. His authority rarely questioned so directly for the first time. It seemed his confidence faltered. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice quieter now. Kendrick collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly." As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often failed to see its own flaws outside. Kendrick pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning. The email Kendrick sent that afternoon moved faster. It escalated faster than Kendrick anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His supervisor, Julia Harper, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with a tone that combined urgency and curiosity. "Kendrick, I read your report," she said. "If what you've documented is accurate, this isn't just an isolated incident. We could be looking at systemic bias." "I believe that's exactly what it is," Kendrick replied. "What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It fits a pattern I've seen before, and I know I'm not the only one." Julia let out a sharp breath. "I'll contact the Judicial Review Commission. We need to handle this carefully but thoroughly. In the meantime, start collecting as much supporting evidence as you can. If this goes public, we need to be prepared." The call ended, but Kendrick's work had just begun. He spent the next several hours reconstructing every moment of that municipal court session. He combed through public records, flagging discrepancies in fines and sentencing issued by Judge Whitman. A disturbing trend appeared. Black defendants were consistently given steeper penalties for minor infractions, while white defendants were more likely to receive warnings or leniency. Kendrick reached out to colleagues and members of the community, including attorneys who had previously appeared before Judge Whitman. The responses poured in. Some shared their experiences quietly, others with unapologetic boldness. A young black woman recalled being fined heavily for a single parking violation, while a white man with repeat offenses received only a minimal fee. Another shared how the judge often cut off black defendants, rarely letting them speak in full. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission launched a formal investigation. Inspectors arrived at the courthouse, requesting years of case files and interviewing court personnel. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, turned out to be a key witness. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had hidden in her desk drawer. "These are notes I've kept over the years," she admitted. "Every time something didn't feel right, I wrote it down. I was too afraid to speak up, until now." Her notebook told a damning story. Dates, names, and examples of unfair treatment were recorded with precision. Investigators also interviewed James Wilson, the courtroom's longtime bailiff. He spoke calmly but firmly. "I've been here 15 years, Wilson said, "and I've seen firsthand how the judge's treatment changes based on who's standing in front of him." "I always knew it wasn't right," Wilson continued, "but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, word of the incident began to spread through the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the courtroom exchange posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking widespread outrage and a flood of similar stories from others. Headlines soon followed. Bias in Greenville courtroom. Federal prosecutor challenges judge's conduct. News outlets picked up the story quickly, and Kendrick suddenly found himself at the center of a growing storm. Reporters called non-stop, but he remained focused on the investigation. The mounting pressure began to weigh heavily on Judge Whitman. Rumors swirled that he had been called into multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight bodies. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately he was beginning to understand just how serious things had become. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received another call from Julia. "The findings so far are staggering," she said. "The numbers don't lie, Kendrick. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. This is systemic." "What's the next step?" Kendrick asked. "We're taking this to the state judicial board," she said. "And Kendrick, this isn't going to go away. The media's all over it. Be ready." Kendrick nodded silently, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. This was bigger than he'd imagined, but he had no plans to back down. By the end of the second week, Kendrick's confrontation with Judge Whitman had become national news. Major media outlets picked up the story. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Unveiled, Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand" dominated the airwaves. Social media exploded with hashtags like #EqualJusticeNow and #Bias in the courts, as thousands came forward to share their own experiences with courtroom discrimination. Despite the spotlight, Kendrick stayed focused, working closely with the Judicial Review Commission to compile and organize the growing pile of evidence. The findings were devastating. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for the same offenses. White defendants who showed up late were often ignored, while black defendants were scolded or heavily fined. Requests for payment plans or leniency were consistently denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just numbers, it was personal. Former defendants came forward, some publicly and others anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for challenging a minor zoning issue, even though she presented clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge publicly humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case involving a white defendant just minutes later. Local activist groups quickly joined the conversation. They organized rallies and demanded accountability. Outside the Greenville courthouse, protesters held up signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "End bias now." Kendrick kept his distance from the public demonstrations as much as he could, but he couldn't ignore the importance of what was happening inside the courthouse. The pressure was mounting. Staff members who had worked under Judge Whitman for years began speaking out. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, emerged as a crucial figure in the investigation. Her detailed personal notes, combined with years of court records, created a powerful and comprehensive case showing bias that stretched back decades. "I never thought anyone would actually listen," she admitted during one of her interviews with investigators. "But now that the truth is finally coming out, I can't stay silent any longer." Even James Wilson, the longtime bailiff, issued a public statement to the commission. "I've seen this kind of behavior for years," he said. "It's wrong, and it's way past time for something to be done about it." Judge Whitman, meanwhile, became increasingly isolated. At first, he brushed off the accusations as mere misunderstandings. But as more evidence surfaced, he scrambled to contain the fallout. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. But his words felt empty, especially when weighed against the overwhelming evidence. Kendrick, though overwhelmed by the growing media attention, stayed focused. He continued his duties as a federal prosecutor, knowing that his mission extended far beyond this single case. Still, the messages pouring into his office were impossible to ignore. He received emails, phone calls, and letters from people across the country. Many shared their support. Others opened up about similar courtroom experiences. One letter from a retired attorney in Alabama struck a chord. "For years," the letter read, "I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us never could." The movement soon spread beyond Greenville. Other judges across South Carolina came under scrutiny as activists and reporters began digging into court records statewide. In response, the state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a sweeping review of municipal courts, pledging to expose and eliminate systemic bias. By the end of the month, the judicial review, the commission completed its preliminary report, and the findings were damning. The implications were unmistakable. Judge Whitman's conduct wasn't an isolated issue, but part of a much deeper systemic problem. The report called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the creation of independent oversight committees. The pressure became too much for Judge Whitman. Faced with the possibility of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, he announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe it's in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." The announcement drew mixed reactions. Some took it as an admission of guilt. Others saw it as a necessary step toward healing. For Kendrick, it was a moment of validation, but not celebration. The resignation was just the beginning. The real work still lay ahead. As reforms began to take root, Kendrick found himself stepping into a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community events, and legal conferences to share his experience and emphasize the importance of confronting systemic bias. His story became a source of inspiration, especially for young lawyers from underrepresented backgrounds who began to see themselves as powerful agents of change. At one such event, a young black law student approached Kendrick after his talk. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people," she said. "You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled. "The fight is just beginning," he said. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after that pivotal day, the courthouse in Greenville had undergone noticeable changes. The once dull beige walls had been repainted. A new welcome desk greeted visitors. Signs in multiple languages pointed people toward resources many had never known existed, like payment plans, legal aid, and clear procedural guides. A small but powerful plaque had been installed near the entrance. "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courthouse, the transformation was even more profound. Judge Whitman was gone, having quietly stepped down. In his place sat a younger judge, widely respected for fairness and impartiality. More importantly, systemic reforms were well underway. All courthouse staff were now required to undergo comprehensive bias training, led by experts focused on exposing and addressing the subtle ways discrimination could influence decisions. Kendrick stood quietly at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the familiar space. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the recent reforms. As he waited for his turn, he felt a mix of pride and cautious hope. Change had begun, but he knew the journey was far from over. The impact of the reforms had stretched far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick's actions, other communities across South Carolina, and eventually the nation, began re-examining their court systems. State judicial review boards introduced mandatory audits of case outcomes, focusing on racial and socio-economic disparities. Oversight committees were formed, made up of legal experts, community advocates, and even former defendants, all tasked with monitoring courtrooms and holding them accountable. Back in Kendrick's office, the shift in energy was unmistakable. The fine he had received that morning, the one that sparked everything, was now framed and hung on his wall. Not as a trophy, but as a powerful reminder of why he had spoken up in the first place. Just below it was a photograph from a recent event, a group of young law students who had launched a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their bright, determined smiles filled him with a profound sense of responsibility to the next generation. The ripple effects in the community were just as meaningful. James Wilson, the longtime bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman, was now leading bias training workshops for new court officers. At one session, he stood before a room of fresh recruits. "Our job isn't just to maintain order," he told them. "It's to make sure every single person who walks into this courtroom is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, speak up. Staying silent makes you part of the problem." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose meticulous notes had been pivotal to the investigation, had been promoted. She now oversaw a new initiative focused on ethical practices in the courts. She devoted herself to mentoring younger clerks and making sure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Kendrick's influence wasn't limited to the legal world. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school on civil rights and ethics in the judiciary. His students, many of them drawn to law because of his story, often stayed after class, eager to ask how they could help bring change. One afternoon, a student approached him, notebook in hand, filled with handwritten ideas for judicial reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick paused for a moment, then replied, "Listen to each other. Really listen. That's where justice begins. To the people who come through our courts, and to those too afraid to speak up, listening is where real change begins." But the reforms weren't met without resistance. Some judges and attorneys pushed back, claiming the new oversight measures undermined their authority. Still, the data spoke for itself. Within a year, Greenville's municipal court showed a marked decline in racial disparities in fines and sentencing. More payment plans were being approved, and more defendants reported feeling respected and heard. For Kendrick, the most meaningful moments didn't come from headlines or speeches. They came from the people. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that fateful morning returned to the courthouse months later to speak with Kendrick. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen a lot of injustice, but I never thought I'd live to see the day someone stood up and said, 'Enough? Thank you for giving us hope.'" One morning, Kendrick opened a letter delivered to his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story. She wrote that it had inspired her to begin investigating bias in her own city's courts. The letter ended with a powerful line. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read the letter twice before gently placing it into a folder he had labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the moment sink in. It was never about him. It had always been about the voices that had been silenced for too long. Voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Kendrick returned to the courthouse where everything had begun. But this time he wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center. named in part to honor his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the audience. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and members of the community filled the room. Their faces held anticipation, gratitude, and hope. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began. "It's about how we treat the people who walk into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about making sure every person, no matter who they are, knows they matter." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Kendrick wasn't focused on the noise. He looked at the faces in the crowd, and what he saw was more powerful than any speech: hope, determination, and the beginning of something real. And in that moment, he knew the work wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction.